guys, to Chapter 8 of Toliver's Secret. Ellen was so happy she felt like shouting, here I am at last!" And she could have shouted too and not been heard at all. With all the noise in the little town, the cries of cannoneers and the rumblings of wagon trains, the pounding of the heavy boots of marching men filled the air of Elizabethtown. And over it all sounded the drums, the screeching fifes, which remember are like flutes, and the wailing bagpipes, which you think of bagpipe. It's a pipe literally used with bags of air. If you look it up, it's very big in Scotland and Ireland. She skipped down the street and ran beside the waterfront. One dock after another was filled with soldiers climbing out of the boats and hoisting up their knapsacks, which is just what they carried their stuff in. She looked eagerly at all the signs hanging above the shops and the taverns that stood against the bluff on the opposite side of the street. Nowhere could she see a sign for the Jolly Fox Tavern. Ellen was puzzled. Grandfather said it would be here and not hard to find, for Elizabeth was a small town. She began to feel anxious and decided to ask someone. Carrying her blue bundle beside her, she walked up to a big, rudely faced workman who had stopped his oxen by a dock and was carrying his ox cart with wooden army chests. His huge muscles almost burst the sleeves of his woolen shirt. Across his fat stomach was stretched a well-worn leather apron. "Where is Mr. Shannon's tavern?" Ellen shouted above the noise of the drums and the bagpipes. "Must be here somewhere," the man's voice said, just as deep as a rumbling of a foghorn. "It's at the sign of the Jolly Fox?" Ellen shouted. "Jolly Fox Tavern?" The man wiped his hand on his shirt sleeves. "Never saw that here in Amboy." "Amboy!" cried Ellen. "Isn't this Elizabethtown?" "Nay, it's Perth Amboy." The man jumped up on his cart and started to push and pull at the army chests to pile them up. Ellen stared at him speechless. Higgins had said their boat was coming to Elizabethtown. "Elizabeth is back there," the man pointed with his chin, "back along the shore about 10 miles or so." But how can I get to Elizabeth?" Ellen cried in a high, frightened voice. "Swim, maybe," he laughed, "but walk lightly." In her alarm, Ellen felt as if her head was about to spin off of her shoulders. She couldn't think, and she suddenly felt very hot. This must be a nightmare. Grandfather had said there was only one thing to do when she got off the boat: walk to the tavern of the friendly Mr. Shannon. He hadn't said she might have to walk 10 miles in the winter, when it was getting late and without knowing the way. When the man looked at her frightened face, he climbed down from his cart and bent over to her so that she could hear him clearly. "Stagecoaches go to Elizabeth," he said, "if you have money to pay." So guys, stagecoaches are very, very fancy type. Well, in my head, I think of like Cinderella when she gets into her carriage. But it wasn't that fancy. But it was pulled by a horse, but a lot fancier than these wooden things that people went around in. Of course she had money to pay. She had the coins in her pocket. "See the big inn yonder?" Which is a hotel. He said kindly as he pointed down the street. "See the fenced-in yard beside it? The stagecoach comes by there to pick up passengers." "Oh, thank you," said Ellen gratefully. In all her life, she had never been on a stagecoach, but she had seen them rolling along the streets in New York. She would climb up and get in a seat on top beside the driver, and she would ask him to stop in front of the Jolly Fox Tavern so she'd have no more searching to do. As she picked her way through the crowds that filled the street, she was surprised to see so many men who looked different from the familiar redcoats. Some had short plaid skirts and bare knees, and they marched to the tune of bagpipes. Grandfather had told her they were British subjects who came from Scotland. Highlanders, he called them. But she stared in surprise at the other big men with hard faces under heavy hats who spoke in words she didn't understand at all. They couldn't be British soldiers, for some wore blue coats and others wore green. And yet, Ellen said to herself, they have guns with bayonets, and they carry knapsacks, so they must be fighting men. Carefully, she edged her way past them, looking up at the grim faces, clutching her bundle tightly in her arms. She hoped none of them would notice her. Why, she thought suddenly, it must be the Hessians. If you remember right, they were the German soldiers. She had learned about the terrible Hessians after the battles on Long Island. Everyone at home resented the German soldiers, they didn't like them at all, who hired themselves to King George to fight his wars for him. They had come over here to kill colonists for money. She ducked her head and darted past them. When she reached the inn, Ellen was dismayed to see that in order to get to the front door, she would have to cross a yard filled with restless horses of the Hessian officers and the grooms who took care of them. She stood at the fence and tried to summon enough courage to walk to the door to ask when the next stagecoach would leave for Elizabethtown. But nothing in the world would induce her to go inside where the Hessians were. Since there were no signs of a stagecoach in the yard, nor anyone there she could ask, Ellen slipped quietly along the street beside the inn, where she spoke to the only person around who wasn't a soldier. He was an old man who was unloading firewood from a cart near the small taproom door of the inn. His boots were bundles of straw tied around his leg with ropes, and his hat had once been an animal of some kind, but it was hard to tell of what sort. The tail, which must have been bushy at one time, was worn to a scraggly rope. So he's wearing like a animal skinned hat with fur. The old man turned around. He looked thin and tired, and his face was so gnarled it seemed to have been made up of dried apples. So his face is just looking very old and dry and wrinkly. Little bunches of gray hairs grew from his ears. He sucked on his wrinkled lip and squinted at her with sharp, beady eyes. "If you wait for a stagecoach," he said sourly, "you'll wait till doomsday." "Why?" said Ellen anxiously. The man slammed 4 logs down on the ground before he spoke. "Because there ain't none." "None at all?" cried Ellen. "The British took 'em. Only the officers ride in the stage now, no common people." The man angrily yanked more chunks of wood from his cart and swore at his old horse. "But how can I get to Elizabethtown?" "Can't." The old man spat a long brown stream of tobacco juice against the tree trunk, loaded the firewood on his shoulder, and shuffled on bowed legs to the taproom. It slammed behind him. Ellen's heart fell to the soles of her feet. Her legs would no longer hold her up, and she sank down on a bench under the gnarled old tree beside the door. She sat so stiff and straight she seemed to be carved from a piece of wood, except for her twisting hands. She felt like a fly in a spider's web. She couldn't go back on to find the Shannons. And she couldn't go back. There was no way to go home now. She couldn't even think. If the only noise would stop so she could think. There was so much shouting and playing of fifes and bagpipes, it made her head whirl as fast as her mother's spinning wheel. Why had grandfather thought she could do this? Why? Had he sent her off across the bay to a place she knew nothing about, with no way to get back home again? Why had he thought a 10-year-old girl could do a man's work? She stared at the company of the Highlanders marching by in their plaid kilts, which, guys, kilts are long skirts that men wear in Scotland, and their bare knees, but she hardly saw them. Her thoughts raced around and around like squirrels in a whirling cage, round and round without stopping. When the old man came back, Ellen saw that someone had given him a chunk of black bread. He was gnawing on it with his gums and gulping it down as if he were starved. He must be a very poor person and very hungry. She jumped to her feet. "Why, I could pay him to take me in his cart." She was so excited the words tumbled out. "Look, I'll pay you more if you'll take me to Elizabethtown." She snatched the coins from her pocket and held them out in her hand. "Here, I'll pay you all of them." The old man looked greedily at the coins in her outstretched hands. His fingers twitched as he reached for them, but at the last moment he put his hands behind his back and shook his head. "Nope," he said firmly. "But why not?" cried Ellen. Elizabeth's north. I go west to go home. Hardly get there before dark as it is." Her hopes fell to her feet like a china cup breaking into 100 pieces. "I suppose I could walk," she said forlornly. But she knew that she could never do that, not 10 miles all alone. She had walked 10 miles before. She and Mother had kept each other company and given each other strength. "Can't walk on that road," cried the man. "That's a right busy road, out past the soldiers' camp. Lots of red coats on horses. They'd run you down." So this is the guy. That's what his hat's visualizing. These are the kilts. skirts that they wore, and his boots were made out of straw. Remember the officer's horses in New York. She was sure they'd run down anyone who got in their way. Perhaps, she said stubbornly, some woodcutter who goes north could give me a ride. Small chance of that, the man snorted angrily. Nobody picks up strangers in these times. He spat at the tree and wiped his mouth with a thin claw of a hand. Too risky to pick up strangers who might rob you or even kill you. Don't you know there is a war on, boy? Yes, I know, but Ellen began. People around here used to be friendly, but no more. He stopped his work and squinted at her. You're a runaway, ain't you? He said as he leaned over and looked at her more closely. Better go back home, boy. No good running away now. Things are bad everywhere. I'm not running away from home. Ellen was so angry her brown eyes flashed and her words came out like hot sparks. My home isn't here, and I must go to Elizabethtown. Can't you understand me? The man stared at her in surprise and bewilderment, which is shock. Then he shrugged and said, well, can't be done. Not in these days. He turned his back a bit and bit off a huge piece of bread. All Ellen could see was the scrawny tail that hung from his cap. Toliver! She heard someone call out, Hey, Toliver! It was Higgins. The men from the boat were marching past the inn with their muskets on their shoulder. They seemed like old friends in the town full of strangers. How are you faring, Toliver? Higgins cried out eagerly. Dow was marching by also. Toliver, she heard him shout. Hope that old gizzard likes squash bread. He gave her a big grin and marched laughing. Why, thought Ellen, Dow thinks this queer old man was the friend who had the birthday. This funny old man with the toothless mouth was so full he could hardly chew. Ellen started to laugh. Clutching the bread beneath her jacket, she ran to catch up with Higgins and march alongside him. You're a mighty cheerful little scamp, he said as he smiled back down at her. I'm so happy to see you, Mr. Higgins, she said, laughing. She thought to herself, Higgins is my good friend, even if he is one for the enemy. She felt funny thinking it, but it comforted her to have a friend in this strange and frightening place. There are soldiers here wearing short skirts. She could hardly stop laughing when she thought of them. Their knees are bare and their legs are hairy. I should think they'd be cold when the wind blows. Higgins laughed to see her so merry, which is happy. And there are Hessians too, Ellen shuddered. I know they are Hessians. They look so fierce they scare me. Suddenly she could feel tears splashing down on her jacket, and all her efforts to be brave broke down. She was laughing and crying at the same time, laughing and crying both together. What had happened to her? Higgins' kind, dark eyes were filled with concern as he looked at her. What amiss with you, Toliver? Meaning, what's the matter? I wanted to go to Elizabethtown, and the boat brought me to Amboy instead. So this is Amboy, said Higgins, surprised. How far away is Elizabethtown? 10 miles. Woo! Higgins glanced up at the sun. Must be 3 o'clock. That's quite a march, he said. But if you hurry, you'll make it all right. Ellen was running to keep up with him. But I'm afraid of going by myself. Being afraid is nothing to hold you back, said Higgins. Just square your shoulders and start. Things aren't so bad after you start. He was fumbling with his pocket. Hold out your hand, Toliver, he said, and he pressed a coin into her mitten. There, go get on the stagecoach, and you'll be there long before dark. Before she could tell him, she already had money in her pocket, and there was no stagecoach. An officer and a big gray horse dashed up to her. Begone, boy, he cried angrily as he flicked at her with his riding crop. I'll have no boys begging from my men, the officer roared at her. Ellen ducked, but the horse kept edging her to the side of the road and turned so she couldn't dodge around him. She couldn't even see Higgins as he marched away. Very carefully, she opened her hand and looked at the coin, a fat silver coin, bigger than she had ever seen, and she couldn't even thank him for it. She might never see Higgins again, but she'd never forget him. He had given her something more important than money. He had been her friend. Now she knew she could do it somehow. Back to the old woodcutter, she ran to ask the way to Elizabethtown. I'm going to walk, she said to the old man. I'm going to walk to Elizabethtown, she said again, when he did not seem to understand her. He looked at her with a faint smile on his face. Well, he said as he gulped down the last of the bread, I did it myself a many a time when I was young and had legs like yours. He took off his cap and scratched his head as he squinted at the sun. Must be nigh on 3 o'clock, but it's a good road. You can walk it at night. At night, cried Ellen. I'm going to run most of the way to get there before dark. I've walked 10 miles before, she said to the old man. I can do it again when there's not else to be done, meaning there's nothing else to be done. She sounded bold. She sounded like a person who could run 10 miles and never stop for a breath, but inside she was trembling. Well, start running then, said the old man, and he turned back to his firewood.